Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of our webinar series, Toward Life 3.0, a series that here at the Carr Center we have been doing for a number of years. It's a series that is devoted to exploring human rights and ethics-related challenges around technical innovation. As many of you will know, we called it Max Tegmark's book of the same title, and the idea is that Life 3.0 is a life where it's a stage of life that is populated also by entities that can choose both their software and their hardware, so the physical bodies that they have and also the kind of learning behavior that they practice individually and collectively. So that's Life 3.0. Which presumably we would have if there were anything resembling an intelligence explosion, which may or may not happen at some point in the future. But certainly what is already very much upon us is any number of human rights related and ethical challenges around technological innovation, and that really is also the background to today's event. I'm delighted to report that I am here today, co-moderator. Her name is Sarah Hubbard. She will join us at the Q&A stage. Sarah is a product leader and strategist with a focus on building emerging technologies at scale, and she is currently here at Harvard University in a double function. She is a fellow in the Technology and Public Purpose Project at the Carr Center here at the Kennedy School, and she is also a fellow at the SAFRA Center for Ethics in their Justice, Health, and Democracy Impact project. So Sarah will be joining me for Q&A. But now the most important task is to introduce the speaker of the day and the topic. We are delighted to have with us today Steve Feldstein. Steve is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in their Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program. He will be well known to many of you who are watching this program for the book that he published in 2021 on the rise of digital. It's called The Rise of Digital Repression: How Technology is Reshaping Power, Politics, and Resistance. And in addition to his career at the foundation, Steve has also been a professor at a couple of different universities, and he has also had a career in the American Foreign Service. He held various foreign policy positions in the U.S. government, and in particular, he was a deputy assistant secretary in the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau in the U.S. Department of State under President Obama. The talk on the themes from his book, the title of the talk today is Technology, Repression, and Geopolitics: Why Efforts to Curb Harmful Uses of Technology Are Faltering. And what is in the background to this topic is the observation that digital technology, as many of you will know or remember, were once seen as a harbinger of liberalization and democratization. So there was this time of immense optimism around them. But in recent years, this optimism has given rise to a substantial amount of skepticism in this era of big data, AI, machine learning, facial recognition, other mass surveillance systems. So there's now a perception that digital, rather than being a harbinger of liberalization and democratization, have become an autocrat's best friend and also a big business opportunity. And in addition, there is also the frequently made observation that liberal democracies have actually failed to slow all this down, both the abuse of these technologies by autocratic governments and very troublesome developments in the private sector. And so the question then becomes, why have liberal democracies stumbled in these efforts to create ethical boundaries of behavior when it comes to the adverse uses of new and emerging technologies? Why have liberal democracies not done a better job in making these technologies actually work out for rather than for the very specific goals of autocrats and big business? So what Steve will do in this talk is to explore the underlying factors driving a crisis in human rights and ethics linked to the repressive and coercive uses of digital technology. And we were just earlier talking about the curious silver linings of technological use in the post-corona era. And one of these silver linings is that Steve will actually be joining us from a hotel in New Haven, because he is not only speaking at Harvard today, but he is also attending an event at Yale. So without further ado, Steve, over to you. And once we come back, once Sarah and I pop back up for the Q&A, I will also encourage you in the audience to put in your questions in the chat. We will be monitoring that. So please think of questions, put them in there, and we'll be integrating them into the Q&A. Steve, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for the kind and warm introduction. I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to speak with the community today, hosted by the Carr Center, which really, is an institution I think has been critically important in helping to spawn dialogue when it comes to understanding better the implications of a range of trends as they relate to human rights, particularly technology. So it's a really good opportunity for me to talk through some of my ideas, and to do so and hopefully have a good dialogue and to field questions in conversation when it comes to what are the implications of technology in today's environment, and what is working better, where are the challenges, and how do we address some of these critical elements that I believe are leading to pretty significant patterns of abuse and violations worldwide. So to begin, when I initially came up with this lecture idea, I had some pessimism about the state of technology and human rights, and the willingness of liberal democracies in particular to take responsibility and push back against repressive technology trends. I have, in the last few weeks, actually become a little more heartened by recent events. Particularly, I want to point to the concluded Summit for Democracy, the second Summit for Democracy that just finished up a couple of weeks back in Washington. As global convenings go, this wasn't one that got a ton of coverage, but I think this summit actually represented a significant step forward when it comes to combating at least one element of repressive technology, which is the proliferation of spyware. One of the biggest steps, and again, it's something that I felt got a little bit buried in terms of news coverage, was the release by the Biden administration of a new executive order prohibiting the federal government from acquiring spyware technology, either that poses either counterintelligence risks or risks of improper use by foreign governments. And I think the second prong is really important, because the executive order essentially says that spyware technology used to commit human rights abuses by foreign government clients, so persecuting journalists, repressing civil society, targeting opposition politicians, is sufficient grounds for a ban, which means that outfits that have been in the news, like NSO Group, will be prohibited from doing business with the federal government and will face a broader chilling effect. So while my research on the one hand shows that the spyware market overall remains robust, that there are at least 74 governments worldwide that have procured commercial spyware technology in the last 10 to 12 years, there is growing action to constrain the industry. And this really gets to the heart of what I want to discuss today, because I believe that we are in the midst of a major struggle when it comes to the ethical boundaries of how governments and private stakeholders use sensitive technology. And I think we see this dynamic playing out all over, from balancing benefits and harms for generative AI applications to considering the ethical safeguards when it comes to battlefield drones, which are both aiding Ukrainian defenders currently in the war, as well as enabling Russia to wreak havoc on Ukrainian cities. So how do we make sense of these dynamics? I think a good way to start is to begin with some basics. As was mentioned, I wrote a book in 2021, The Rise of Digital Repression, which describes how autocratic leaders, liberal regimes, and even democracies are deploying digital technology tools for political advantages. Now, the argument is that as citizens increasingly go online for all aspects of life, from work to personal communications to business transactions to e-commerce, political leaders are seeking to harness and control digital communications. Now, there are built-in advantages that they can exploit when it comes to deploying digital tools. There's lower prospect for public backlash versus more traditional techniques. So digital surveillance versus physical surveillance is much more passive, yet it also is something that is very pervasive. Digital technology, digital repression can help solve the principal agent problem So that's the idea that you have to worry about the loyalty of security forces if you deploy them on the streets, but if you have an algorithm that is undertaking mass surveillance, you don't have to worry about that loyalty issue if you are a regime. And that there, over the long term, there tends to be lower costs associated with this type of surveillance or censorship techniques as well versus traditional methods. And so what we see from that is a continued growth and reliance on digital tools linked to censorship, to surveillance, to internet shutdowns, and disinformation around the world. Now, this is where I'm going to share a slide so that you all can sort of follow along with some ideas I want to put out. So the first slide accompanying what I just mentioned is this. So this shows you here digital, democracy and digital repression trends from 2003 to 2022, and essentially what it represents is a global mean that I totaled up year by year. And as you can see, there has been a lot of concern about backsliding globally when it comes to levels of liberal democracy. And certainly there has been a modest decline, frankly, when you kind of look overall at the numbers. But what we can see in conjunction with that is a significant rise when it comes to use by all manners of governments when it comes to digital repression. And so the global mean continues to rise. And even as of last year, these are new numbers I just calculated. It looks, pretty grim. So that sort of shows you the 20-year kind of longitudinal trend line. Now, here, next, I want to show you, this is the actual distribution of digital repression for last year. And I think there's a few things that are worth pointing out. I think one of them is, looking at kind of the general relationship between uses of digital repression techniques and levels of democracy. And so, the red represents higher digital repression, the blue represents lower. And you can see a pretty distinct pattern emerge, where if you are a country that has low levels of democracy, you can see Russia and China that are bathed in vast swaths of red. You can see the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia as well. You can see the Horn of Africa. Then it is very likely and predictable that you will also have higher levels of digital repression. And you can also see where, conversely, where countries that have much stronger levels of rule of law, protections, civil liberties, and so forth, where you have much lower levels of digital repression. So looking at Europe and the EU, Southern Africa, North America, and parts of South America as well, Australia too, you can see also much more in blue. So I think that's important, just to kind of lay out a pattern in terms of understanding what the distribution, of this looks like. Now, so as we look ahead and evaluate prospects, and as I talk more about this in the next in this lecture, in this talk about curbing digital repression uses and upcoming challenges, I really want to highlight two areas to focus on. So one I want to talk about is the importance of the market when it comes to dictating the pace and scale of digital repression. And then second, I also want to talk about the catalytic effect of the Ukraine war. So why don't we first start and talk about market demand. So last month, I co-authored a Carnegie working paper that builds on lots of the research that I presented in my book on the spyware industry. And that asked the question, what explains the resilience of an industry that, despite public scandals and growing regulatory pushback, continues to thrive? And I think the answer really is that there remains persistent and growing demand from governments and private sector entities to acquire these capabilities. So what does this look like graphically? So this is something we put together. We put together an original data set where we combed back records and transactions for spyware surveillance going back to 2011. And what we really tried to do is any kind of transaction we could find that linked to, first we try to figure out what company was associated with that transaction when it comes to spyware, what country they're based in, and then what client state sought to acquire this. And so you can see quite a few things here. That, first of all, while there may be a perception that spyware is something that is relegated to a handful of companies, in fact, there are many companies that are in the market, and when one company faces trouble, other companies are willing to step in. What you also might find from this is that there are a pretty even range of countries, of governments that are represented here, who are both places where companies are headquartered, who are distributing or supplying spyware, as well as governments who are seeking to acquire it when it comes to either democratic or authoritarian regimes. So we see all manner of different governments here, from Ethiopia to Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Morocco, some of your classic monarchies or autocracies. But we also see the United States, Spain, Greece, Poland, Hungary, Germany, lots of classic, very strong liberal democracies as well. And so I think it really does sort of demonstrate that it's a pretty heterogeneous mix when it comes to both how invasive surveillance tools are distributed, as well as where the demand signals for these tools, where those are coming from. Now, even if, so one of the interesting things, one of the things I've explored, in the paper is that even if liberal democracies successfully come together and ban all major commercial outfits, you still wouldn't solve the problem, because one, you'd see new entities spring up in authoritarian contexts, and two, you would just see the growth of an informal market to service this demand. So what this kind of gets at for me, and I think one of the key points I really want to emphasize, is that the problem isn't really technological. Even though it is technology, we tend to think about solutions in terms of what kind of fixes can we make. But I think a better analogy is arms control. Once a potent capability is unleashed, political and security incentives ensure there will be demand for that product. So in some ways, in fact, the big scandals that we've seen associated with Pegasus and NSO Group have brought about a perverse dynamic, in that the more autocrats have seen how damaging these tools are, the more they seek to acquire them. Now, that's not to say that there aren't strategies available to confront the spyware industry. Certainly constraining the market, so raising political costs for countries to procure tech can be very effective in hybrid regimes like Nigeria or Serbia. Pushing global norms, so raising public awareness and disapproval of targeted surveillance that makes this technology less acceptable in many countries to purchase or sell, is another strategy. Enacting regulatory strategies, so the executive order that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, tightening different multilateral configurations, putting together a surveillance initiative, having more robust implementation of human rights guiding principles, are all strategies that can help to constrain the market. And then certainly putting pressure on the highest, most public offenders. So the symbolic effect of penalizing NSO Group or Kangaroo, some of the leading firms, can help cut down on the most sophisticated military-grade technology, as well as send a signal about limits when it comes to what is acceptable, what is not, when it comes to this technology. But ultimately, I think politics and not technology will determine how frequently spyware is used. And I think realistically, spyware is not a solvable problem, but I think that harm mitigation strategies can reap tangible gains. And so that's one point that I really want to leave when it comes to spyware. I think being emblematic of a broader set of tools and a broader set of industry linked to digital repression, where there is a lot of frustration when it comes to what we can do, what liberal democracies can do to try to stem the flow, and the fact that the underlying root causes are very complicated. So now the second thing I want to talk about is a catalytic effect of the Ukraine war. So major global conflicts have historically accelerated technological innovation. Look at World War II as just one case in point. The Ukraine war is no exception. And I've written quite a bit about the role that ICTs have played in the war. And one dimension of that, I think, has been Russia seeking to co-opt Ukraine's digital infrastructure. Now, here is something actually interesting. So this was in the kind of early days of the war, the beginning days, and this is a television tower in Kiev. And what was interesting here is that this represented one of the first types of infrastructure that Russian military forces targeted. And they targeted the TV tower because they recognized that severing the ability of Ukrainians to either consume or produce information would be key to the Russian forces being able to assert control very quickly over Ukraine. But what they got completely wrong, and there are many things that the Russian forces and many blunders that they have gotten wrong over the last year plus of the war, is that because so much of information consumption in Russia is based on television consumption, they made the same assumption about Ukrainians' habits, and they actually completely overlooked in the early days the importance of severing internet connectivity, which is how so many Ukrainians actually get their news, as opposed to simply targeting more analog television towers. But the idea remains, which is that information is power, particularly when it comes to this conflict and probably for subsequent conflicts going forward, and that this is an aspect that adversaries will increasingly factor into their plans when it comes to war, conflict, and the battlefield. And what we have seen, even despite the kind of mishaps early on, have been that in occupied territories, Russian authorities have forced multiple Ukrainian ISPs to switch their services to Russian providers, thereby exposing customers to Russian surveillance and censorship. Russia has also blocked access to social media platforms by cutting off news websites and shutting off Ukrainian mobile networks, forcing individuals to use Russian mobile services. And so really a key Russian goal has been not only to capture Ukrainian data flows, but to exploit the information for military gain. Now, conversely, what we also have seen is that platforms have allowed the Ukraine to harness international public on Ukraine's side. And that has translated to support via military armaments, as well as sanctions against Russia. And so we're seeing now a really interesting terrain of struggle take place worldwide that's centered in Europe, in the global South, and even in the United States, where you have different narratives that Russian propaganda outlets and Russian influencers are pushing when it comes to justifications for the war and reasons why supporting Ukraine is something that the public shouldn't do. And you also see as well, even on kind of a more granular level, the kind of use of different information technology to prosecute the war, with Starlink being one of many examples of that, as well as Ukrainians themselves relying upon connectivity in which to crowdsource the location of Russian military forces, to use government apps in which to provide tips about suspicious people who might be collaborators, invaders, or saboteurs, and even to aggregate data on maps that are then used by intel officials for counterstrikes in operations. And so on the one hand, we might look upon this and say, well, what does this have to do with the kind of broader context of digital repression? And what I would say to that, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk about the context of the Ukraine war, is that I think it gives rise to several ethical concerns that cut across a range of issues. And I think will cause us going forward to ask some very difficult questions about the nature of power, what role technology plays, and to what extent have we set up an appropriate level of safeguards in which to better constrain how technology is used. So I think one question relates to how much power should be vested in a private company or individual with a crucial wartime role. And certainly, we can look upon that in terms of companies like Starlink or Palantir, each of which is playing a pretty critical role when it comes to allowing for Ukrainian forces to withstand assaults and to organize themselves accordingly against the invasion. But we also see an interesting emergence of companies that traditionally have sought a more neutral role. So Microsoft, Cloudflare, Amazon Web Services, Cisco, other providers which have very quietly behind the scenes helped with providing Ukraine with a range of things, whether it is teleporting data in the first days of the war to ensure that local data centers, which were subsequently destroyed by Russian forces, would actually that the Ukrainian government would still have data for its citizens to be able to access. We see Cloudflare and Microsoft playing critical roles when it comes to providing resilience to cyber attacks by by Russian forces. And in a just war scenario where the lines are very clear in terms of defending against these types of this type of invasion, it might be something that we can kind of glide over and say, well, clearly there's an aggressor. Helping citizens defend themselves against such a strike is something that is justified. But in blurrier contexts where there are less clear battle lines in terms of which side is justified in terms of carrying out military operations, this is where I think the geostrategic nature of things, particularly as it relates to technology companies, will become blurry and will become difficult. And so, are we prepared to think about how that will play out? I think a second thing, and I'm going to move this over, is the blurring of lines between military and civilian actors that technology has embedded that we see in the war context, but we're seeing, I think, play out in other contexts as well. And so the necessity of war entail using all means available to defend against the invasion. And I think there have been few hesitations that Ukrainian citizens have had when it comes to how the government has repurposed different government apps and other tools to help with defense of Ukraine. But I think there are longer-term repercussions that bring uncertainties. I think one question has technology lowered too far the barriers to entry when it comes to enabling civilian involvement in conflict? And I think there are direct implications about when civilians qualify protections and when they are considered active belligerents, and that civilians may not even be aware that they are compromising their protected status when they're uploading information about a Russian tank that they see onto an app that is subsequently used by Ukrainian forces for military strikes. And so, I think it brings up a host of questions about how should international humanitarian law treat civilians who periodically upload footage that is later used? What kind of uncertainties arise from the new digital dimension of conflict? And what type of heightened risk does this bring for civilians when it comes to having clarity about the rules governing war? I think a second thing that is critical for us to think about is the implications of rapid technological innovation on the battlefield that is leading to unintended and unknown consequences with grave human rights repercussions. So, for example, there are ongoing efforts right now to incorporate greater autonomy into the battlefield targeting process. Rather than simply presenting streams of battlefield data, AI systems that are being used are developing capabilities to make independent targeting decisions with minimal human input. As researchers from the UN Institute for Disarmament Research write, battlefield environments are harsh, dynamic, and adversarial. And under these circumstances, autonomous systems are bound to face problems and could potentially fail in complex and an unpredictable manner. So despite these risks, Ukraine, as well as Russia and others, are actively developing fully autonomous killer drones, systems that are, quote, logical and inevitable next steps in weapons development. Russian forces may be close to deploying autonomous drones, with officials claiming that the Lancet drone can now operate with full autonomy. And I think the long-term spillover effects are troubling. Other actors, such as Iran and Turkey, already possess impressive techno-military capabilities. They are paying close attention to their drones' effectiveness on the battlefield. If more states are convinced that autonomous drones are the key to the future of war, then they will be motivated to pour resources into developing these technologies. And due to the open technological revolution, where innovation has shifted from governments to private commercial firms, a wider group of countries can acquire advanced tools for military uses. One of the things that I am working on currently in terms of my research has been to specifically look at the ways in which the diffusion of advanced technologies, including drone technologies, has really enlarged. And so right here, you can see, dating back to 2013, I examined CIPRI's arms transfer database, specifically looking at exports of drones. And I boiled down after looking globally at countries around the world I boil it down into sort of 5 kind of leading exporters. And what's interesting is certainly the United States and China are 2 countries that have maintained robust sales of drones over the past 10 years. What you increasingly see is the growth and emergence of new entrants. Iran to some extent, Israel much more, and then Turkey to an astonishing extent have really taken over the market when it comes to the proliferation of military-grade drones. Turkey's rise has really been something to watch, and you can see here where prior to 2017, it registered no sales at all, and now it has emerged as one of the leading suppliers of TB2 drones in the world. And so what this means for our purposes is that, assuming that AI battlefield tools will proliferate widely and that efforts to establish ethical and normative guardrails will fall behind the pace of innovation, how will new entrants who are proliferating these tools, diffusing them, how will they further scramble this equation? I think what this does is that this will increase the risk that military applications of emerging technologies will spiral out of control. And I don't know that we have any clear sense of whether and how autonomous weapons will reflect international humanitarian law guidelines developed over hundreds of years. I think as long as humans remain in control of weapons, they can, in theory, be held accountable under international humanitarian law for violations committed when using those devices. But this is where technology begins to scramble the equation. What happens when a machine makes a decision to take a life, and questions arise over the legitimacy of that action? Who is accountable for crimes deemed to have occurred, and how can a chain of responsibility be determined? So where does this leave us? I think the good news is that there's a rising level of awareness and concern about these issues. And you see across the board, whether in the UN system, whether bilaterally or multilaterally from different configurations of liberal democracies, primarily, efforts to build global consensus about these risks and steps to establish safeguards. I think right now we're facing twin challenges. I think one, we have a pacing problem, so that innovation is far outstripping regulation across all sorts of domains, whether we're looking at large language models and generative AI applications, whether we're looking at the use of digital tools and surveillance and spyware, or whether we're looking at autonomous weapons within the context of the Ukraine war and future battlefields. I think the second challenge we're facing are geopolitical fractures, in the sense that there are low incentives right now for adversaries, particularly China, Russia, the US, to find common ground when it comes to establishing basic guidelines for acceptable use of emerging technology. And so what we risk is a race to the bottom, where a proliferation of newer entrants, Turkey, Iran, Gulf states, Israel, South Korea, India, making efforts to making it harder to reduce the risks of these technologies. Yet I also think that self-interest can motivate countries to adopt regulation. And I think a good example of that is a spyware executive order I kind of keep turning back to, which is the sense that, part of the reason for the executive order finally coming out from the US government was concern about human rights abuses and the public scandals arising from Pegasus. But the other reason for it was concern about spyware technology being specifically used to target US personnel overseas, diplomats, other government officials. And so once spyware shifted from being solely a human rights concern to one that impacted the national interests of the US, the government acted swiftly. And now we see a cascade effect where other liberal democratic governments are also considering different regulatory steps to follow in line. So likewise, I think when it comes to regulating AI for military use, I think self-interest can be usefully leveraged. And I think part of what is needed is for countries, is for leaders like the United States to set global standards for responsible AI use, for example, and to encourage other leading countries like China to take similar precautions. And I think leading countries can clarify practices and safeguards. They can collaborate on a very limited basis to develop mutually beneficial safeguards to reduce the risk of catastrophic AI failures. They can commit to restraint in the use of offensive operations incorporating AI capabilities. So I think there is a narrow window for cooperation, even when you have two countries that are strategic competitors. I think there is sufficient mutual benefit to make this viable. And so I think we have to keep trying. I think we dedicate so much of our front-end resources and energy into developing new technologies. And only ex post do we realize the looming problems we have brought upon ourselves. But I think building in greater foresight and regulatory heft earlier in the innovation chain would bring significant benefit and public good, whether it's in relation to liberal democracies or more globally for citizens around the world. So why don't I stop there? And I look forward to your questions and to having a dialogue. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. That was amazing, very informative. Really appreciate it. I'm going to touch on maybe the first question of what you were just talking about and where you ended there. You were mentioning, AI being used on the battlefield. I'm curious, how else do you imagine like the recent rise of AI will continue to exacerbate a lot of the digital repression issues that you've identified and outlined in your book? So, imagining everything happening with OpenAI and deep fakes and misinformation, disinformation, like what else should we be thinking about of where AI is going to be used?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. No, really, really good question. I was actually thinking about that a bit today. I sort of anticipate, especially with all the kind of concern in the last month or so, in terms of ChatGPT-3 and ChatGPT-4 and Google's Bard and so forth. I think there's been a lot of scrutiny associated with large language models, and I think and so let's focus on that kind of for a second, at least when it comes to AI. And part of what I think is challenging is that it still feels a bit speculative in terms of what types of harms will emerge. But I think we do know a few things. I think one, we can certainly anticipate that the scale that will occur when as it relates to existing harms like disinformation will increase. That large language models powered by certain bad actors will be able to proliferate to a much larger extent disinformation, deep fakes, all sorts of means in which to pollute the information environment. So we can anticipate that that's something that will certainly increase and bring about greater challenges. I think we can also anticipate that we'll have much more of a granular ability to micro-target individuals at scale. So it's sort of like you're bringing together two weird concepts. One, you're talking about individual things based on a user's data and information profile that are used to convince them of one particular action or another, but you're able to do that very quickly and at a mass level because of the computing power associated with large language models, and so that also kind of brings concern. And then I think third, in terms of just all the the kind of different kind of the infrastructure surrounding how we conduct transactions, cyber attacks, hacks, and so forth. I think we have to anticipate a larger level of volatility in terms of how, I think, at least initially, how much more disruptive some of these attacks can be that are powered in ways that we just haven't anticipated. But so much of this, I think, is just kind of we're really entering a terra incognita when it comes to understanding exactly what this will lead to. Whether it'll be a deepening of sort of existing pathologies, or will we also open up new and unintended consequences that we just haven't been able to anticipate because of the nature of these technologies.
Let me also encourage the audience once again to put questions in the chat. I see there's a couple of things already there. Let me follow up with a question of my own here. So I really appreciated that on various occasions you touched on this phenomenon, Steve, that what we're observing, that technological innovation is really questioning often really the foundations and the commitments of humanitarian law and the just war tradition. Obviously, these are modes of thinking that come from a completely different era and never anticipated the availability of this kind of technology, the possibilities of civilians to be involved in such ways, and which then might question their status as civilians. And all of that, of course, will be questioned yet more once we make this transition from deploying unmanned drones, which have proliferated already, to fully automated weapons technology, which has been a big headache for the human rights community for a very long time. So many people in the human rights community have tried to get the development of automated weapons, fully automated weapons technology banned, absolutely to no avail so far. How do you think this will go on? When will they be? And you mentioned they're being deployed, they're being developed as we speak in a number of places. When will we see them deployed? How far is this away?
Yeah, no, I mean, to me, it's really something of concern. And, one of the reasons I wanted to spotlight the Ukraine war is that I think it is a really important moment when innovation leaps ahead, due to necessity. I think for a long time, we were sort of admiring the problem of drones, and we saw it in the context, more or less in kind of unequal ways, where you had kind of a larger military power, primarily the US, using them against in much lower capacity, non-governmental organizations, like ISIS and Al-Shabaab and so forth. And so it didn't feel like there was much of a threat in terms of two actors with similar capabilities using these tools and being forced to innovate in a very rapid way in order to gain an edge. So, one of the things that we don't know now, even in the context of the Ukraine war, is how long that war will last. And I think the longer it does last, and there seem to be no indications that's going to end anytime soon, the more we'll see, I think, technology. We'll see the war as a forcing function in terms of greater levels of autonomy being associated, with these tools out of necessity. What that leads to, it's hard to say. My understanding, at least from those who technologists who work on AI and autonomous weaponry, is that a large amount of this can be done today, and it's just a matter of kind of choice when it comes to design procedures, keeping a human in the loop, and so forth. So that's sort of like one aspect, is that I think we are sort of in the beginnings of the onset of kind of this movement towards greater levels of autonomy. I think another kind of aspect to that, is sort of what do we do about it? And I think, I think in this way, I think the self-interest ought to be a starting point. In that, I think the one thing we do see is that this type of technology is something that very quickly can be adopted and innovated by a wide number of countries. And just as much as it's used to target Russian military forces and vice versa, Ukrainian forces as well, I think there ought to be concern among the US military, among the Chinese military, and others about the potential catastrophic aspects to how this technology might be unleashed. And I think that ought to give pause to anyone. I mean, just as we've seen a certain class of weaponry by necessity forcing adversaries to the table, whether in the Cold War context in relation to nuclear or chemical weapons or otherwise, I think that as we see the potential risks associated with autonomous weapons, there ought to be at least a coming together in terms of minimal standards and safeguards when it comes to how these are used, because there's no reason why this won't even affect any type of weapon system ultimately. So I would start with self-interest in that respect.
Maybe I'll jump in and ask another one. So one of the next steps that you had called out was this need for like global norm building, especially to, avoid this risk of racing to the bottom here. I'm curious, have you seen any good examples of that kind of global norm building played out so far across any of these different, digital repression kinds of elements, like whether that's in the midst or disinformation, whether that's in, use of autonomous weapons in warfare? Like, have you seen any good examples play out so far that maybe give us some hope?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And I think actually, I mean, if anything, what I am trying to do is sort of, get people to think more critically about what are pathways and solutions to grappling with these challenges. I don't think that it helps anyone or is productive to be a doomsayer. On the other hand, I think we have to be realistic about the nature of the challenges that we're grappling with. So, let me point to a few different ways in which I think global norms are taking root. I think, on AI governance in particular, we've seen a lot of activity occur multilaterally and with a strong push from Europe. I actually have a paper that's coming out in Democratization in a few weeks that sort of talks about the European experience in particular. But what we've seen from the OECD context in terms of building up global norms related to trustworthy AI, and then how that's been taken up subsequently by UNESCO in terms of its AI recommendations, and how it's now being incorporated in a variety of forms, whether it's in the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights in the United States, or NIST framework, risk management framework, or whether it's the AI Act in Europe. There are pushes that are occurring that are a result of, I think, a burgeoning and emerging understanding, normative understanding, that some of the risks, the high risk applications associated with AI need to have floors in terms of safeguards. And so I think that's one example where the progress has been slow. The pacing problem that I mentioned earlier is something that remains a big challenge. And yet I do think that there is emerging consensus in different corners around the world to push for a greater set of safeguards when it comes to at least thinking through higher level risk associated with these technologies. And so I think that can be kind of a model or framework in which to think about other ways in which to push global norms when it comes to downside risk to digital technologies.
I'd like to go back to Eastern Europe and ask one question about Belarus, which is my question, and then I'm going to bring in a question from the audience about Ukraine. So map earlier, capturing the extent of digital repression in particular parts of the world, that Belarus had the same tone level as India, and so Belarus did not rank to be particularly low, and I was actually surprised. I would have thought that Belarus is one of the worst places in the world in terms of digital repression, but it didn't seem to be. And then, since we're in the neighborhood, there's a Ukraine question from the audience. Somebody is asking specifically about online threats and hit lists. Are they being made that are targeting dissenters and critics of the pro-Ukrainian position? So can you maybe describe the threat level against in the war scenario against pro a bit more?
Yeah, I'll do my best on both. Let me start with the data. So what I would say about Belarus is certainly ranks poorly, and probably what is more surprising is less that Belarus is bad, but how poorly India performs as well. And I think this is what, one of those situations that people don't recognize, that despite being, the world's largest democracy, it really has exhibited significant democratic backsliding, and that has also linked to digital repression. So India leads the world when it comes to internet shutdowns. There was just a story in the Financial Times 2 weeks ago that talks about how Indian officials are seeking to spend $100 million on a spyware contract. They don't want to spend that on NSO Group because of all the public scandals. So they're actually looking for alternative suppliers who can do the same thing as NSO Group, but doesn't have the associated reputational costs. When it comes to deployment of mass surveillance systems, that is also something that is happening with increasing frequency in the country. And so I think, the sort of lesser known story is that there are lots of disturbing trends and patterns associated with digital repression in India that have, I think, really corroded, kind of governance in that realm. And, I would have to dig a little deeper into the data to kind of give you a more granular answer in terms of how India specifically compares to Belarus. And frankly, it's an interesting question. Maybe we should follow up separately on that because that's something that, from time to time I can do. But just kind of off the cuff, my answer would be Belarus is bad, and India has exhibited pretty astonishing backsliding on digital governance as well as democracy as well. Now, in the second question, in terms of the targeting of pro-Ukrainian voices, that's not something specifically as an issue I've looked into. But what I can say, if this is sort of a question associated with what does persecution look like in Russia, what we do know, particularly on the technological front, is that increasingly Russian authorities are using different surveillance methods, from facial recognition in Moscow's metro to identify anti-war protesters who are then persecuted, to social media monitoring to look at who is saying kind of negative things, whether it's on Telegram or other places, who are later subsequently arrested and brought to trial. And this, I think, really is illustrative of my larger point, and that, the digital repression strategy very much right now in Russia is wrapped up in the politics, in the sense that even if you look back 5 or 7 years ago, there was a little more of a space kind of given to dissent, and there was a kind of a mutual understanding where there were certain lines that those criticizing the regime should not cross, but in return they were kind of given some space in which to express criticism of Putin and the regime. Because of the pressures associated right now in Russia, because of the squashing of dissent period, those understandings have completely gone out the window, and we're seeing mass arrests, and we're seeing new levels of surveillance and persecutions and censorship that we haven't seen in the Russia context before. They're much closer and akin to what one would see in China than in prior years.
So another question that I have is, you've mentioned that innovation is really outpacing regulation. So I guess in lieu of, having comprehensive legislation or, a lot of government support. I mean, you did mention like Summit for Democracy and executive orders and things like that, like liberal democracies are doing. But what is the role for either other actors, I guess, to play in this entire process? So for example, like, journalism or these kind of self-regulatory like oversight boards that, for example, like Facebook has. Like, what are the role for these other actors, I guess, in terms of this, how do we fight back against the digital repression that we see rising?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I think, the answer, boils down to multi-stakeholderism, and the idea that it's an ecosystem where all sorts of actors have a role to play, and that together, I think that can contribute to an environment of greater transparency and accountability, and that they each kind of there's an interaction that occurs between these different actors that can help galvanize action. So, for example, when it comes to the spyware issue, I mean, so much of this has broken precisely because of the work of the journalist consortium, the Pegasus Project, that has come together worldwide to expose the abusive practices. This has then led to public pressure and motivated policymakers who otherwise, would see this as a problem better left to another day, to then take this up and expend political capital in which to put forth regulations that will help constrain the issue. So without having journalists at the forefront exposing and writing about and documenting these abuses, and then without having civil society groups taking up those messages and directly advocating, at least with democratic governments, for action, and then subsequently holding governments accountable once regulations are put out when it comes to enforcement and implementation, the whole thing falls apart. And so there's all these sort of different legs. And then, of course, as you rightly pointed out as well, there's a private sector role to play also. Now, I think in certain cases, when you have, companies that are just inherently bad actors like MSO Group and, or unaccountable, look at Hikvision or Huawei. In China, there's not really much one can do, but a lot of companies oftentimes fall in the middle, and they face public pressure, whether it's from shareholders, whether it's from their holding companies, whether it's from private equity firms that are investing in them, and so there ought to be and is an incentive for companies to at least take some steps to put in place safeguards, voluntary codes of conduct, and so forth, to offset some of the worst abuses. I mean, there's a whole body of literature and guidelines that come out from the UN, called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, that have been out there for a decade plus, that give pretty specific guidance in terms of requirements for due diligence ahead of time, knowing your customer, ongoing human rights monitoring, clawback provisions, and so forth. And they're just routinely ignored. But it's not as if we're sort of, we don't have to make up this field. It exists. The methodology is there. It just needs to actually happen and be enforced. And so that's the good news, is that we know how to do it. It's just companies choose not to. And so, that I think offers a pathway for some action.
So I'd like to ask you about two more countries that you talked about, and so I'm going to do that. But then I'm also give you one more question from the audience, which will then probably also give you an opportunity to say some concluding words, since then presumably we're going to be out of time. So the two countries I'd like to ask you about are Turkey and Israel in terms of the drone sell. About Israel, I mean, I was not surprised to see Israel there. So in Israel, technology is it's a major part of the economy, and Israel has been well known for being in this space. But my question about Israel is why have they sold so few drones in recent years? Is this just kind of a statistical regularity, and it will change next year? Is this a kind of a general change of trend? Since clearly they sold quite a bit more a few years ago. And about Turkey, my question is why is Turkey in this at all? So in Turkey, the tech sector is not pronounced for the country economy overall. Why are they leaning so far to the window, specifically in terms of selling these drones? And then the question from the audience, as a way of giving you an opportunity for some concluding thoughts, is don't the recent debates, that we see make clear that neither the public at large nor our legislators have a useful knowledge of AI technology, and how important is it to build a broader understanding of AI? That would be a good general way of, finishing up.
Great. Well, let me start with your good questions. And this is actually kind of represents kind of this ongoing line of research. In fact, I was just crunching the numbers last night on the last graph that I showed you, the CIPRI data. So I'm still thinking about it myself right now. And I think part of it, when it comes to Israel, I don't know what the story is there yet. It could honestly just be data lag. These numbers obviously are hard to come by. Oftentimes transactions can be hidden or clandestine, or you could have gaps when it comes to maybe you have, because the data represented orders, not fulfillments. Fulfillments is a little harder because it spans over different years. So it could be that you had higher orders that need to be fulfilled. So I don't know that I would read too much into it yet in terms of a relative decline in Israel. But what I can say is that certainly, without any question, Turkey's investments in drones and the public acclaim that's had, which is translated into drone sales, has definitely increased. And I think that's been very clearly, you can see that very clearly in the data, and it matches very well anecdotally what we've heard. And I think what Turkey has done is that while it isn't a technology leader across the board, it has invested in certain niche technologies with military applications in the last few years in a very effective way, with the drone industry not being the only one, but one of those. And I think the marketing has been done well, in addition to kind of the cost per unit, which is very attractive to countries that want to have this capability but don't have a ton of resources in which to pay for it. And so those aspects, I think, have really accelerated this push. And I think it's been deliberate on the part of Turkey, and in which to gain geopolitical influence and to have greater leverage when it comes to a product that is in high demand from many different countries around the world. And that's just something I've written initially about a few months back. But I think there's more to sort of think about and understand on that front. And then in terms of kind of the kind of final question about the need for policymakers to better be aware of the kind of risks associated with AI and other emerging technologies, I think that's absolutely the case. I think it's, we are rapidly moved to a new moment, one that I think has been jarring for a lot of us, where the old assumptions about the role of technology in our lives are quickly slipping into new ones. And frankly, none of us really know exactly what this will mean. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of kind of the social media moment that we had 15 years ago, maybe, where at the time, we thought, oh, okay, well, this is interesting. And now we're having a new way to communicate and consume information and share with friends and whatnot. And then first we saw kind of the spawning of different color revolutions in the Arab Revolution. And then we saw the turning of the tables to electoral manipulation. And there was this kind of lag between one and the other. And certainly no one really anticipated that, the 2016 election in the United States and so all these other examples of electoral manipulation would have occurred. I think the difference in this moment is that we're probably on a more accelerated timeline. So A, it'll happen more quickly. And B, we continue to sort of be stunned by these unanticipated developments. The good news, I think, for all of us is that we are more aware of the downside effects to what information communications technology and its innovations can bring. we have more of a kind of global framework available to us in which to consider steps needed. And I think it's incumbent upon citizens, civil society, researchers, academics, and others to work closely with policymakers to inform them of risks and to help push for action when it comes to legislation, directives, and so forth, particularly from a liberal democratic viewpoint. So that's the charge I'll leave you as we hit upon the hour, that there is a lot of room for action and activity. And I hope each one of you sort of takes it upon themselves to sort of find ways to push for accountability in this arena.
Excellent. Thank you. Sarah and Steve, if you wouldn't mind just staying on the Zoom just another 15 seconds after I've said goodbye to the audience for just some very quick debriefing. But at this stage, let me say goodbye to the audience. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Thank you to Sarah for co-moderating. Thank you to Steve in particular for this fascinating talk. I think there is just there's quite a bit ahead of us. There's a lot of change here. There's a lot of change in the way war is conducted, in the way people are involved in that, and the way the ease with which war might be waged in the future. This whole idea of a human in the loop while also having automated weaponry, it seems that I think there's a lot of big questions ahead of us. What this would even mean to have a human in this. This sounds very comforting, but at the same time from the idea that this is fully automated. So I think there's just going to be some serious thinking that will need to be done also to make sure that the world doesn't take a wrong turn on these things. And it's terrific, Steve, that people with your level of understanding are in this debate. So thank you for being in these debates. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today. And again, thank you to the audience for joining us today. And I hope to see you at another webinar at the Carr Center at some point soon. Take care, everybody.